Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Shanila Khoja-Mulji, and I'm a faculty member at the Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding here at Georgetown University. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest, Professor Shobhana Xavier, who will speak about her latest book, Dervishes of the North. The book examines Sufism in Canada and takes a particular interest in how the 13th century mystic poet Rumi influences the ritualistic, sensorial, and devotional practices of Muslims, as well as non-Muslims. Professor Xavier is an associate professor of religion and diaspora at Queen's College in Canada. She works on contemporary global Sufism with regional interests in Canada, the United States, and Sri Lanka. She's also one of the co-hosts of the popular podcast channel, New Books in Islamic Studies. Professor Xavier will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a chance to engage her in a conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm really glad to spend some time with you today as well. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, perfect. Generally, as an introduction about who I am and the work I do, I work on contemporary Sufism, and usually, in the global north, I guess you could say, in United States and in Canada, but I also work on Sufism in South Asia, so I won't cover too much of that today. But as a result of this, I'm kind of thinking about Sufism often in really global ways, transnational ways, even though sometimes they're really rooted in geographical context. Another aspect of me, and which informs kind of the work that I do, is that I'm an ethnographer. So what that means is that I do spend a lot of time with communities and lived realities, participating in community rituals, talking to people. So interviews form a lot of my data collection, which I'll bring into the conversation today. And so broadly, I kind of use these pivots to really think about what Sufism looks like today. And what this means is that for me, my understanding of Sufism is quite capacious. This is perhaps something theoretically or conceptually that maybe not all scholars who study Sufism may align with, but this is kind of the orientation that I've taken, and partly because it's been defined by what I found in the field. So often we think about Sufism as something that's part of Islam, connotes a spiritual or aesthetic or mystical dimension of Islam, and this is all true, really inspired by teachings of the Prophet Muhammad and the Quran. But one of the things you'll note as I talk today is that actually Sufism in some variations have also diffused into popular culture and just, the global north in very interesting ways. And so that means that Sufism kind of looks different, and that Sufism sometimes is not considered or taken seriously. And for me, I just kind of cast a wide net and take all of these things in my analysis and in my data collection, partly because I think in following these details and these practices, you start really learning some interesting facts about how Sufism is being lived, and that helps us think a little bit more differently, perhaps about Islam or popular spirituality or religion. So this is kind of my broader agenda goals in my work. And this has informed most of my publications to date. So my first book was on sacred spaces and transnational networks in American Sufism. And this looked mainly at one particular community, the Bawa Mujahideen community in in Philadelphia, Toronto, some other branches in the US and Canada, but also in Sri Lanka. And this one, again, I really gravitated towards sacred spaces and spent a lot of time with the community. And this community was interesting partly because they have a really interesting, thriving shrine culture. The Sufi teacher Bawa Mujahideen, when he died, he was interred in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, and it's attracted in a lot of different expressions of ritual and devotion amongst Muslims and not Muslims. So you kind of see a similar thread in this early work as well. And with my colleagues, Dr. Mina Sherifi-Funk and William Laurie Dixon, we worked on a book called Contemporary Sufism, Piety, Politics, and Popular Culture. And here we also did similar work in terms of mapping Sufism as it was being experienced in, you could say, quote unquote, Islamic contexts or Muslim majority contexts, and how it was being transmitted across different non-Muslim contexts, especially during this moment when there was colonial encounter and the world was being opened up in really dramatic ways. And one of the things we did in this book is really pay attention to how Sufis, particularly through poetry, were being exposed to Europeans and also the Americans. So during the Orientalist context, or when colonialism was unfolding in these complicated ways, one of the things that's happening is also ideas and knowledges and books and art, all these things are being diffused or transmitted either across the Atlantic or to European context, where Muslims start having an imagination of what, where non-Muslims start having an imagination of what Muslims are like or not like. And so there's stereotypes that are building. And I think part of understanding the influence of Rumi today can really be traced back to this broader exchange, sometimes violent exchange, but ultimately an exchange that takes place where people start having our ideas about who are Sufis, these mystical dervish-like beings who perhaps were not Muslim, maybe they were other than Muslim. And so this becomes one way in which we could trace how Sufism is traveling to these different places, right? Is through the imagination, through art. So one of the common tropes that really emerges is the idea of the whirling dervish, right? With the white skirt. You see this in a lot of paintings, a lot of travel logs, people who are traveling to the Ottoman Empire are really writing about this. And slowly what's also starts happening is that some poetry that is framed as Sufi, ultimately, usually Persian is also being translated piece by piece, and that is also being shared either through people's travel logs or diaries or letters that are being sent to friends and family members in different parts of the world. And so this is also all one way in which this diffusion is informing how people have an imagination of what Sufism is. Often it's something that's being separated from Islam because they think Islam is tied to Arabic. And a lot of the Sufi poetry that they're encountering is tied to Persian. So this slowly starts informing some of the bifurcation or separation that's happening between these ideas. And so it's influencing, let's say, European romantics who are reading some Persian poets or American transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson. So there's a huge kind of genealogy to some of this, and a lot of wonderful scholars have written about it. And so I kind of pick this up ultimately in terms of understanding some of the ways in which Rumi and Sufism is being encountered in the American context and the Canadian context. Of course, in the 1960s and 1970s, we have a huge counterculture moment where a lot of people are really interested in spirituality. They're leaving maybe churches and synagogues and are encountering Hinduism and Buddhism. There's this growing concern around cults, right? And so all of this is also informing kind of this moment in which Sufism gets presented in the American context. Some people will say the Western context as something that has not to do really necessarily with Islam, but kind of the broader spiritual kind of encounter. And for me as a scholar, I think all of this background really informs some of the way that I think about how Sufism is being experienced today. So when we have this moment in popular culture and you're thinking about, why is Hollywood so interested in Rumi, or why particularly Rumi, I would say, is Jennifer Lopez wearing a t-shirt with a Rumi quote. We don't know if it's, actually attributed to Rumi or not, but there's this idea of Rumi in the popular imagination, or Beyonce's, one of her twins' names is Rumi, or there's ideas about a Rumi Hollywood blockbuster film that perhaps Leonardo DiCaprio is supposed to play. You start then thinking about, well, where is this all coming from? And for me, instead of thinking that it just happened, what I do is I take a step back and say, well, actually, let's look at the bigger picture. How did we come to this moment, and how can we kind of process this moment, right? I was just in Seattle a couple of weeks ago, and I went to the big, Pike Place Market, and I went to it was tagged as a spiritual shop, but they had, incense and healing herbs. But I saw on this wall, this magnet wall with all these different images of, Hindu deities or Buddhas. And of course, there's lots of whirling dervishes and Rumi quotes on the wall with Jesus and indigenous spirituality as well. So this kind of image helps us situate this kind of broader spiritual popular culture that I'm interested in, and how Rumi in this particular context ends up on this magnet wall ultimately, right? I am in the Canadian context, and one of the things I noticed while being in Toronto, where I did a lot of this field work, but also Montreal and Vancouver, is that a lot of museum spaces were also kind of presenting ruling dervishes and cultural performances, or in really these big events. The Aga Khan Museum is one, for instance, and it's also tied with the Smiley Center. There were smaller venues that were also presenting Rumi workshops. And so thinking about some of Rumi in the popular culture context and having some of that intellectual knowledge about what was happening, and then seeing some of the things that I was seeing in Toronto, at least, in some of the spaces that I was moving around, really got me thinking about this bigger question about Rumi and how did Rumi become as popular as he did in Canada. And this is ultimately one of the bases for this book project that emerged, The Dervishes of the North, where I started thinking about this more seriously, but I also wanted to do some mapping of Sufism in the Canadian context. So since this was the first book on Sufism or monograph on Sufism in Canada, some of it is just laying a bit of groundwork. And so I'll map a little bit of that, but hopefully I could shift into some of the more substantial chapters, especially on popular commodification and perhaps gender if we have time. The first chapter in the book situates kind of my theoretical framework, if you will. And like I said, I'm not thinking about Sufism and experiences and rituals of Sufism only in the context of Muslim communities or sometimes, Muslim diaspora communities. I do understand that it is an Islamic practice, but what I also, understand and approach is that a lot of people who are non-Muslims are also tapping into it. So instead of choosing which route to go in, what I do is kind of follow both routes to see what do we learn, what are we missing. And so in chapter 1 of the book, I kind of outline this and say, well, why are people, what is this genealogy of Islam in the Canadian context? And where is it coming from, right? And I don't frame it purely as a diasporic one, ultimately. And in chapter 2, I kind of spend time mapping some of these communities, right? And again, a lot of these are Canadian based, but I ultimately end up focusing and shifting towards focusing on Rumi affiliated communities. This is because this becomes one way that I could process some of what's happening in the Canadian context while thinking about this bigger question about Rumi and popular culture. I do want to say that Rumi based communities are not the only communities in Canada. There's lots of immense diverse communities, and I hope other scholars will pick up this research and study all these other diverse communities. In any context, when I do talk about Sufism in the global North, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that the first likely expressions of Sufism were in kind of through the bodies of embodied enslaved folks who were brought from the West African context across the Atlantic Ocean due to slavery, right? Scholars have done some great work, especially in Omar ibn Said, for instance, in which we know now, due to kind of amazing archival work and studying of his autobiography, that, for example, Sufism was really important part of his Muslim identity and his repertoire of Islam. In his autobiography, he mentions, Sufi figures like Ibn al-Arabi. And so even though we know that perhaps we don't have archival evidence to support the ways in which Sufism was being practiced by folks, we can, based on some information that we do have, know that this was very much part of folks' identity, especially African enslaved people's identities, right? The other thing that becomes really complicated too is that in our contemporary context and scholarship or people's identities, people might have a tendency to identify as a Sufi, but that's because of a certain political moment, right? Historically, to say that you are a Muslim and a Sufi, it would sound redundant, actually. Sufism informed so much of Islam that the idea of separating it actually seems unnecessary. So this becomes one of the challenges of studying Sufism in historical context, especially in the global North, because folks would not have been actively identifying in that way, but would have just identified as being Muslim, right? But nevertheless, I think it's still important to think about this historical moment and the genealogy of how Sufism would have first emerged in the North American context, even though it wasn't being expressed or organized or institutionalized in any way, right? most often when we talk about Sufism in the North American context, we start with the figure of Hazrat Inayat Khan. He was a teacher who came from India and, got on a boat with his, a ship with his cousins and brothers in a musical troupe. He was a musician and played the veena, and he arrived in New York, right? And even though he came to perform music, and that's some of the ways in which he got an audience and then started meeting people, he himself understood part of his mission was to come to America at the direction of his teacher to talk about or share about Sufism to the West as it was presented to him, right? Of course, what this means is that as Hazrat Inayat Khan is coming to the West in the early 20th century, most of the people he would encounter were mostly actually all non-Muslims. So this informs the way in which he's presenting his Sufism. He would likely, and we know, universalize some aspects because most people might not have known the particularities of Islam. So this then informs kind of the ways in which Sufism would been presented to some American non-Muslim audiences and their reception of it. And this genealogy continues to inform some of the ways in which Sufism is experienced even today in 2024, right? So Inayat Khan and his sons would form an important thread to the kind of population of Sufism in the North American context, but also Europe. Inayat Khan didn't stay in the US for long. He eventually moved to Europe, and then from there, that both those continents becomes an important way in which Sufism does get spread through his teachings and his subsequent descendants. Ultimately, it's really in the 1960s that you're having again, which aligns with this popular, the counterculture era of the 1960s and 70s. You're seeing the arrival of Muslim teachers, be it from Sri Lanka or Turkey, who are coming and who are going on tours and attracting American students and starting to teach them. And so that becomes this important context in which lots of different Sufi teachers come. And I'm not able to go through all these different lineages, but suffice it to say, there are lots of different lineages, even ones that are not presented here. So Hidayat Inayat Khan and Vilayat Inayat Khan, for instance, are sons of Hazrat Inayat Khan. And they, for instance, would come to Canada, Vancouver, let's say, or the Rocky Mountains to hold retreats and teach individuals, Canadians predominantly, who are interested in Sufism as well. Rashad Field is a really interesting figure, particularly to the Vancouver context, or broadly even the West Coast, because he was moving between Los Angeles, sometimes Seattle and Vancouver, so kind of this Cascadia region. And ultimately, what I do in the book is focus a lot of my time on kind of his lineage and the communities that formed subsequent to his arrival. Rashad Field was a British teacher. He traveled around Turkey, got really interested in Sufism. And so his book, The Last Barrier, becomes this kind of cult classic in Sufi circles. And ultimately, his teacher, Bulan Rauf, said, and he writes about this in his preface to his book, The Last Barrier, had sent him to Vancouver to start a Sufi community there ultimately. So a lot of people were being sent to different places by their Sufi teachers to start, different organizations. And so Rashad Field would be one person who was sent in that way. And so this is where you're starting to see a particularly interesting development of Rumi-based communities in Vancouver. Rashad Field hosted a talk in 1973 in October at the YMCA in Vancouver. And John Brozak, who shared this poster with me and some of the archives and who I spoke to, told me that he and Rashad Field, and there was only one other person. So there wasn't even a lot of people at the time when Rashad Field first came, but somehow they built momentum and they started kind of having reading groups. And so they would start reading, let's say, translations of Ibn al-Arabi's work, or start reading Rumi's work. And sometimes folks from Seattle or, the West Coast would also come to Vancouver, and they would kind of move around. What ultimately happened with Rashad Field is that his teacher, Suleiman Loris, who was a teacher from Konya, also started coming. And Suleiman Loris would be kind of the basis for forming the Mevlevi order in the United States. But in Canada, there was a separate group that, at least in Vancouver, a separate group that emerged, the Turning Society, which ended up being the Rumi Society. And so this group is kind of the group that I focus on, partly because in the Vancouver context, this group really started focusing on the practice of turning. So Suleiman Loris had initiated a few teachers, and these teachers often held gatherings, right? So Majid Bull, up until last year, actually, when he passed away, was one of the individuals who had the initiation from Suleiman Loris to hold gatherings. And so students were initiated into the practice of turning, and they would host gatherings, you know, the Sama. And this is happening for decades in Vancouver. And so this kind of community is a community that I focus on to trace this practice and relationship with Rumi, the practice of turning. And so from this genealogy comes figures of Rakib Brian Burke, who is a Samathan Bashi. Ultimately, what that means is somebody who is a master of turning. Shams Al-Haq, Farzad Akhtar Joffrey, who organized Rumi Canada, and is also a member of Vinyatiya, and Tawhida Tanya Evanson, who leads a space in Montreal, known as Sama Space. So these are individuals whose genealogies, especially in terms of practicing of turning, goes back to figures like Suleiman Loris to Rashad Field. And so this is type of the work that I'm doing in terms of mapping. But I also acknowledge that there are lots of other communities as well. There's lots of different diasporic communities. And it's not purely just communities that have emerged in the Canadian context, but people are also migrating to the Canadian context and establishing communities. And these tend to be ultimately many Muslim organizations. So the Jarahi Sufi order, the Jarahi Helveti order, for instance, also has a center, very active in terms of turning practices and holding similar practices, both in public and private context. And they tend to be a predominantly Turkish, Albanian, so Eastern European Muslim community that has a center in Toronto. So this is a community that I also discuss in the book. And there are Persian communities such as the Namatulahi, based on the teachings of Javed Norbaksh as well. So lots of different communities. And in the first kind of little bit of the book, I map these communities to set them up as best I can. It's not meant to be comprehensive, but essentially giving a bit of an outline to the diversity. Chapter 3 and chapter 4 and chapter 5 are kind of the substantial, I guess, the juicy parts of the book. And this is where I kind of go into, after setting up some of these communities, some of the particularities in terms of ritual practices, and some of where these, you know, these complexities are emerging in terms of, well, how do we define Sufism? What is the intention around these practice? And again, I focus on ritual practices as a mapping, because I think it's an easy, tangible thread, at least for me, to kind of see, well, how are these practices unfolding in this context versus this context? And are they changing in the process, or they're not changing in the process? So one of the things I focus on a lot is this idea of sama, right? In classical, you know, early development of Islam, there's lots of discussions about sama, and particularly zikr. Zikr is this practice of litany of remembering the names of God, and it becomes really, really central to most Muslim Sufi communities. But there's a lot of diversity in the sense that some communities will say zikr silently with no music, no movement. Other communities will practice zikr with music and movement. And this is where there's some debates amongst, you know, classical scholars about, is music allowed? Is it permitted or not permitted? Can people who are not initiated into this practice be exposed to this practice? Because maybe this ritual is too intense and people need to be trained to be able to be introduced into this. They can't just be thrown into it, right? So there's a lot of debate about what's the right time, what's the right place, and in fact, even who should be present and who should not be present. So in chapter 3, I really kind of unpack some of these and I lay some of these debates out. I don't, again, take a side and say this is the right or wrong way, but essentially I'm ultimately setting up this context of what are these debates? How have historically scholars thought about them, particularly in terms of music? And there is definitely a lot of debates about the permissibility of music from an Islamic legal perspective to Sufi scholars. But ultimately, I think there's a general consensus of this practice of zikr, sometimes that unfolds in the context of sama, with music and movement and listening to music, is really, really important because it alters the psyche. It has, you know, you might be induced into go to ecstasy or wedged, right? This is like a really important ritual practice. And so this practice, how it is presented becomes really, really important. And it's really efficacious. It means that it really works for some communities. For a community that is affiliated with Rumi, this practice of using music and movement, of turning, is really, really important. It's one of the things that really distinguishes them as a Sufi community from other Sufi communities. So even though we have this historical debate, one of the realities is that at the same time, Sufism is being banned in Turkey at kind of the turn of the 20th century because there's a secular project that's emerging. Because of this, what happens is that this practice of turning and kind of the music that gets associated is being kind of switched in from a ritual experience to kind of a cultural experience, the way to preserve this practice. So we could say a lot about that, this debate about religion and culture and what constitutes what, and it's so entangled, it's hard to separate, right? We know all of these things. But because there's kind of an internal shift, even coming from Turkey, to preserve these Sufi practices, what happens is that these practices are being presented within kind of, the world music scene. This is what ethnomusicologists will often say, right? And, organizations like UNESCO sponsored tours where Rumi, based kind of whirling dervishes are traveling to Paris and presenting this practice, and people are buying tickets, paying ticket money to go see it, sit in an audience, right? So this is not happening only in the Canadian context. This has been happening before, right? And Shams Freelander's book is a great book to kind of map some of this if you're more interested in seeing it. And there's some great photographs in there. But I kind of mapped that this is happening globally, but this is also obviously something that's happening in the Canadian context, right? And there's a lot of debate about, is this ritual? Is it public performance? Can we actually separate the two? Is it possible? And I spoke to community members. I spoke to whirling dervishes, teachers of this practice who have been doing this for decades, and asked them, essentially followed them around and asked them. So Rita Tanya Evanson, who is pictured here, turning, and she's turning. This is a public performance that took place in Toronto or outside Toronto, and she's presenting with Niaz, a Persian American music group. And she, is very clear that, yes, she gets invited to a lot of these events, right? And sometimes, some of the invites are like, we want a whirling dervish to open a show at a club. This has happened, but when these kind of asks come into Tawhida, she is very clear in terms of the intention, right? She says that, yes, it could have a performative aspect to it, right? In our conversation, it came out. But even if the performative aspect of Sama, it still needs to be done with this intention of beauty. It still needs to kind of fulfill these broader, Sufi ideas of haq, truth, of what is it that you're doing, and are you doing it in love, right? Because it still has some utility for the people that are witnessing it. It's not just a one-way encounter of the person who's doing the turning. It actually has an impact. And this kind of aligns with some of these conversations that early Sufis, especially Sufi theologians, are having around the parameters of this practice. Should it be done publicly, or is it something that needs to be closed up and protected, and people need to be trained to it, right? And so contemporary whirling dervishes that we're seeing in these kind of big stages are also navigating these relationships. It's not that they're just going on and presenting. They're also having these like big questions as well. And another big ritual that happens is the Shabi Aruz, which is the death anniversary for Rumi that takes place in December. People in the millions travel to Konya, Turkey every year in December. It's become a huge tourism thing in Turkey, where they go and participate and see whirling dervishes. But in the Canadian context, you're seeing, this moment, this holy day, being commemorated in smaller spaces that are closed off for the community. So again, this is Tawhida's community in Montreal, and they host, kind of biannually, depending on scheduling, a gathering for the Shabi Aruz, where whirling dervishes from the Canadian context gather in Montreal, and there are smaller group of community folks who gather. And it's this entire evening that's spent in community with each other, with prayers, zikr, turning, and folks are also invited to participate in turning. It's not purely, it's not just the whirling dervishes. They hold the gathering, but there's an also opportunity, an experiential opportunity to participate as well. So it's kind of interesting to see that people are, whirling dervishes, teachers are moving within these circles. They're not only presenting in public theater halls, but they're also really cultivating this practice in smaller community spaces, right? And so I continued to build on this theme in chapter 4, and this is really kind of the big chapter, I guess. I've been getting a lot of emails from folks who are teaching this chapter, and I'm really, really grateful. I'm glad that it's of interest in the teaching capacity. But I think this is a big thing, big question that really provoked this book for me in terms of consuming Rumi, issues of commodification consumption. I think this is kind of the thing a lot of people are really grappling with, and it's great. I think we should have conversation around it. For me, when I'm situating this chapter and thinking about Rumi whirling practices and moving from kind of what the community is doing within their own spaces to what's happening in kind of the broader spiritual landscape, I'm thinking about a few things. I think a lot of people think that consumption doesn't happen within religious spaces or even Muslim spaces. We often forget about the halal economy, or we forget about popular culture, but we're seeing a lot of fascinating things happening with Muslim popular culture, right? In terms of Miss Marvel or Turkish shows or South Asian Muslim shows, right? Muslims consume, and they also have purchase power. It's just a reality of things. This is not something that is a development in our time today, but historically, religion and economy have been kind of mixed together and moving together. And we may not always like it because capitalism is not a good thing sometimes or most times. But I think it's important to kind of situate the fact that commodification is a reality of just religions generally, and that means that we have to deal with some things, yes, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? People make money, religious communities make money. It's kind of just the way in which money flows, right? Now, the ethics around it is just something we should definitely have a conversation around. I think some of this Rumi stuff and rolling stuff is also being mixed with kind of other issues that are also happening around appropriation, especially within indigenous spiritual appropriation or conversations around yoga and mindful meditation. And I think wonderful scholars are really documented some of these kind of other practices and are trying to do similar mapping within those religious communities and questions of ownership. Who has the capacity to commodify an item? Who has the capacity to gatekeep? So these are all questions that I'm contending with this in chapter. And one of the things I use is kind of this brilliant article, What is the Wrong of Cultural Appropriation, by these philosophers. And they have like a really great outline of some important questions to think about. For example, one of the criteria they ask is the thing that's being commodified or appropriated, so the X in this case, maybe Rumi or a ruling practice, does it have a historical or contemporary status that we need to consider? Or is the community that is this practice is associated with, do they have a social location that has been politicized or disadvantaged in some way that we need to consider? So they highlight these criteria and they ask kind of like, let's think about this and see how this informs, the answers to these questions inform this practice that we're trying to grapple with that is being culturally appropriated. So I set this all up. And I really think about scholars like Catherine Lofton, who have done amazing work with kind of religion and consumption and religion, the economy, especially with Oprah and, as a cultural icon and what's the purchase power of those things. My take on all of this is that because things are being infused into the popular culture, we need to be aware that there's actually significance to that, instead of saying, well, we can't engage with it at all. I don't deny that there's some problems in the ways in which some of those things are being purchased or commodified. But what we should also consider is who's doing these things and how it's informing this actual practice, instead of just saying we're not going to deal with it. And so this kind of approach of taking these these registers of Sufism seriously comes from kind of some of the things that scholars like Catherine Lofton have done in terms of following the commodity and seeing what kind of purchase power it has and what it says. And of course, I'm totally cognizant that this is coming at a context where people have these kind of important critiques. Scholars like Omid Safi and others have really noted the erasure of Islam from Rumi. And I think this is really, really important. And this is exactly what this kind of criteria setting up is like, can we think about the historical reality of this object or idea or practice that is being culturally appropriated, and in what way is it being appropriated, and what are kind of the communities who are associated with that artifact, how are they in relation to kind of broader systems in the world, right? And so noting these different kind of realities is really important. But as this chapter shows, the further you go kind of this path, the more complicated it gets, right? Coleman Barks, for instance, whose versions or renditions of Rumi that are the most popular, has his own Sufi connections and was connected. His Sufi teacher was Bawa Muhyiddin, who I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, and he said that he had directives and was, taught by Bawa to continue this vernacularization of Rumi to the American public. He's very clear that he's not translating, but rather he's taking translated versions by others and interpreting them through himself and is presenting them. But of course, his are the versions that become really, really popular. That's informing the production of perfumes. The Rumi vodka one is a curious one. I don't know that I could rationalize that one, but again, really kind of interesting to think about the purchase power of Rumi, right? But again, I think in light of all of these things that are happening, I go back to these communities, communities that are really focused on poetry or the music and performance aspect, who are Sufi communities, many of them Muslim. And I asked them, how do you situate yourself in light of these broader things that are happening around you? And I won't be able to get through all of it, just to make sure to save some time for questions that I see. But so I'll end off with some of these comments. One example that came out that was really interesting is the Naqshbandi Haqqani Kabani community in Vancouver. They have a Rumi rose tea that they're really known for. And this Rumi rose tea is in a store that they run, like a storefront. And above that storefront is the Sufi space where they gather. So all of these kind of items, perfumes, incense, Rumi rose teas are sold, but the community gathers above, and they are in constant zikr and all of these things. And I remember when I was speaking to the Sufi teacher Nurjan, I asked him, it seems that perhaps you're using Rumi as a kind of it's a branding move to sell Rumi. And he said, well, these are things that are inherent to our culture, right? He's speaking from his perspective. Tea is something that's a healing medicinal reality for he framed it as a Muslim culture. And so he says, yeah, selling tea, you might read it in one way, but he says the way they read it is that you are in a space in which we are in constant meditation, in constant zikr, reciting the names of Allah all the time. And all that energy that is being, exuded, released is now being informing or kind of seeping into these items, the teas included. So when you go home and drink it, you're also ingesting that, which is really, really interesting. So even when I had purchased some Rumi teas from him, he said before I left that I should come up to him and that he was going to pray over the teas and offer some du'as, intercessions for me. So when I go home and have that tea, I'd also be ingesting that baraka, the blessing and that healing, right? So it's interesting that, an initial read of this, especially from Instagram, we would think, oh, this is just kind of a branding move, but community like the Naqshbandi Haqqani Kabanis have a really other read on what's happening ultimately too, right? And the same thing can be said in terms of kind of the public presentations we're seeing. Again, I think in places like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, it's important to say that this is part of a longer genealogy, right? It didn't just start happening in the last 10 years, but some of these communities trace their practices all the way to the 1998. And so in 1998 was the first time one of these Rumi festivals took place where it was presented to the public. There was art and music, right? And so this has been going on for a few decades in the Canadian context. We're just seeing more of the popularity of it now, right? An event like, for Rumi's birthday at the Smiley Center, where you have hundreds and hundreds of people who are present and the presentation is presented publicly, right? And I spoke to Farzad Akhtar Jaffrey about this. He often wonders, should I be doing it? There's constant questioning amongst the dervishes that I spoke to themselves about these practices and the need to do these practices in public context. And they ultimately say it's always about the intention. But it's interesting that Farzad Akhtar Jaffrey told me that when they have these workshops and people come, sometimes you get people who are shocked that it's like too progressive, right? And so might become coming from Muslims who think, well, why aren't you presenting this in an Islamic context? But he also gets non-Muslims who are saying, why are you presenting this in an Islamic context? We thought this is universal. So it's interesting to see that these tensions are tensions that they're also experiencing, because there's a public perception of what these are, right? And it comes with some baggage ultimately. So I'll end off on this point just so that we could have some conversation. I think commodification and consumption is just like a complicated reality. I do take Catherine Lofton's kind of approach that just because things are being commodified, it doesn't necessarily mean the sacred is diminished, because what is complicated in some of the spaces and practices and exchanges I encountered is that many Muslims are also participating in the commodification process and kind of the sharing process, right? And so for them, there's a lot of intention in the ways in which they're doing it. There is this other facet and complication that, because of the tendency to universalize Rumi or aspects of Sufism, this is kind of entangled with this issue of Islamophobia, which I think we see this legacy of how Sufism has traveled, and this is how I started the conversation. The move to universalize Rumi and kind of rid Rumi of kind of some aspects of Islam is also tied with kind of this idea of Islamophobia, right? Because the less Islamic or Muslim Rumi is, the more that he's presented as being digestible, but that also comes with the reality that more liberal spiritual individuals might gravitate towards Rumi, but there doesn't mean there isn't still latent Islamophobia attached to it, right? But the other end of the spectrum is also that some Muslim communities and individuals don't like Sufism, and there's kind of a negating of Sufism as part of Islamic identity. So I don't think any of these things are existing individually. I think ultimately all of these things are coexisting. That's informing kind of the way in which Rumi is packaged and received amongst certain communities, and is kind of informing some of the expressions of Sufism that I'm encountering in my research. So if it's okay, I'm going to stop there, and Shimala, maybe we could take some questions. Does that sound good?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for a brilliant presentation. There are so many questions, and so and we have a hard stop at 12:30.
Yeah.
So what I will do is that, if you don't mind, I'm going to select some of the questions, because it seems that some of the other ones you responded during the last slide.
Okay.
So my student, and I should note that my students have read your book and they loved it. And as you mentioned, the chapter on commodification was their favorite. So, and so I think you'll see that there are also lots of questions around that too. But my student Madison asks that in the Ottoman context, dervishes, or the spaces of worship, were often also spaces of political and social unrest. Has this practice transcended into or transferred into the Sufi communities in Canada?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things that's happening is that whirling dervishes, so with climate catastrophe and some of the kind of public protests that are going on now, some of the whirling dervishes are also individuals who have taken up whirling and have been whirling in those protest spaces. And so when Greta Thunberg was here in Vancouver, some of the dervishes had sent me pictures. And I think Simi Ghazi, who's on the call, a teacher in Vancouver, had shared that their dervish community had gone, and they also whirled in those spaces and said zikr in those spaces as a way to kind of politicize the event as well. So I think we have a tendency to take Sufis particularly as pacifists or apolitical individuals, but that's a great legacy that has continued, is that many folks are kind of using the practice. I know Tanya Evanson has also done that in public spaces as well, turning sometimes in the red outfit, which is kind of really intense, and turning in public spaces and protest spaces as a way to kind of tap into some of these political conversations that are and social movements that are going on, for sure. It's a great question. Thanks.
And another one actually perhaps can give you a chance to speak about your gender chapter a little bit more. So the anonymous question is, Sama seems to be traditionally a devotional ritualistic practice observed by men, but this has been challenged recently. What are your thoughts on the inclusion or exclusion of gender diversity in these spaces?
Yeah, so I didn't get a chance to get into the gender chapter, but the gender chapter talks a lot about just women in these spaces. Again, Simi, who's here, is one of the teachers who leads these rituals in Vancouver, right? And I think she leads them in public spaces and non-public spaces as well. And the whirling dervishes themselves are men, women, queer, right? Gender non-conforming as well. So this is one of the interesting things where Suleiman Loris, when he first shared the practice, there was no gender segregation. He allowed men and women to turn together. And this has been a practice that has been sustained by the communities. And Tawhida Tanya Evanson, who has her own community in Montreal and is teaching, is, a woman who's teaching men and not, kind of in gender fluid ways, which is really, really interesting. Another thing I'll note is I think because of the contemporary moment in which there is instances of a lot of spiritual abuse taking place in communities. I mean, this is conversations that are coming up in Buddhist communities and Hindu communities. And these are also conversations that are coming up in Muslim communities in terms of not being safe in kind of predominantly patriarchal and heteronormative spaces. I think the gravitation towards Sufi women teachers like Simi or Tawhida or Aida Hussein, who's another teacher I speak about in the book, is also really, really important, because I think people are finding safety, especially because turning is such an embodied practice. Like you're not sitting like, in yoga, there's like movement and things like that. It's very similar in turning, especially if you're not just going to see it, you're actually practicing it, right? So during research, often I wasn't allowed to just sit in the corner. I was always told that you need to come in and participate. And when you're participating, like, your body is out there and you're kind of moving. And so to have women teachers who are part of this process, not to say that women teachers cannot be also spiritually abusive, but I think there is a turn that's happening now in which, because of this and because it's a Canadian context and because these Sufi spaces can evade certain gender norms, Sufi women teachers are seen as far more kind of safe, particularly in this type of practice that are happening, that therefore people are gravitating towards them. So that's why the gender chapter in the book, which, sorry, I didn't have time to discuss, is really, really important.
Excellent. Thank you. There's another question. Do you feel that there is danger of a spiritual practice losing its religious significance when being rendered as performative or as part of popular trend?
Yeah, this is a big question, right? Like, I think this is something that I thought a lot about, and I asked all of the kind of teachers and the whirling dervishes that I spent time with when writing this book about. And they also, what was interesting to me is they were also grappling with these questions. There was never a moment in which they were like very definitive and said, yes, this is an easy path to forge ahead. They were also internally grappling with it. And I think one of the things, they did was they often had to sit with a question and really figure out their intention before proceeding forward. So it's often a case-by-case basis that I saw that they were negotiating when they were being invited to events. They might say, no, I'm not going to come to your club and start turning for you, because that's the threshold. But for them, it was also kind of this question of, okay, let me make my intention clear and figure out if this is a space in which I need to practice this. So for me, I think it's important to know that this negotiation is ongoing and it's never set. And it's not that they said they'll go wherever and always, but it's always like, let's check in and let's kind of process if this is a space in which this kind of practice needs to be shared. And I think that negotiation was individualistic based on their kind of own practice and path when they responded. But I think once they also saw it as an opportunity to share the practice and the teachings. In Sufism, there's this notion of tasting, like you give a taste. And Tawhida Tanya Evanson, in my conversation with her, often said, you can't invite them to the entire feast, but it's kind of okay to give them a little taste of the grape. So maybe that they'd be curious to come and experience it more. So I think for some, they also saw it as an opportunity to share the teachings of Rumi. And if people were interested in pursuing it, they could pursue it further. So there's kind of different responses in that sense. But yeah, I think as a religious studies scholar, I do think, at what moment is this practice losing like it completely? And I kind of am hesitant to place that boundary, because I don't know that it's my responsibility to answer it, but kind of say, well, these are what the individuals who are the teachers in these movements are saying to me, right? Yeah.
No, that makes sense. You mentioned in passing that another audience that your interlocutors think about are other Muslims. So this is not just Muslims, but non-Muslims, but Muslims who might actually don't think of Sufi interpretations of Islam as legitimate. Can you speak a little bit more about that interaction? What are perhaps your interlocutors' expectations or hopes in relation to that group?
Yeah, I think this is when there is a context in which there is performance predominantly for, let's say, a Muslim community who follows Islamic law, like, 5 times prayer, so Sunni Muslim communities. There is a tendency where issues around gender becomes a little bit more of an issue, fascinatingly, right? And this is where gender is really interesting to think about, because I think gender becomes a way in which, if a community is mixed gender or women are turning with men in this space, that may mean that a Muslim community who has particular ideas about gender norms according to like an Islamic legal perspective may not want that. And so what often ends up happening is, as those communities end up presenting for, let's say, more universal or Sufi groups that have less attachment to Islam, and then therefore gender becomes a way in which they say, well, they're not really real Muslims because they're doing this thing that according to their interpretation of Islam. So this is where I often say that gender becomes a vector of demarcating legitimate versus non-legitimate Islam, which is really, really problematic, I think, if you think about it. But this is also the reason where Sufi teachers who are women like Simi Ghazi, Aida Hussein, Tawhida Evanson end up being teachers of communities that Sufi groups looks more as universal from the outside, but then they get critiqued that these are not real Muslim communities either, right? So this is where I think the Muslim community's perceptions of Sufism and how it should operate in a particular register becomes a little bit complicated. And I often see it unfolding, particularly around gendered bodies ultimately. And the communities that are more gender egalitarian end up being critiqued as a New Age Sufi community, when in fact they are Muslim communities who do follow Islamic law, right? And they may fast during Ramadan and they are praying 5 times a day. Since you are a scholar of Ismaili communities, Ismaili communities are really interesting because they tend to be far more appreciating of this, right? We don't want to just frame it as Sunni Muslim responses to Sufism, but the fact that a lot of these kind of public performances are taking place at the Aga Khan Museum or the Ismaili Center, I think there is an instance where Ismaili Muslims who are probably experiencing similar kind of legitimization arguments about their orthodoxy as Muslims, they tend to see these Sufi practices far more representative of their version of Islam. And so they have no problem with gender mixing, and they have no problem with any of this music and all of this stuff. So there's actually a spectrum, right? Like not all Muslim communities are responding to Sufism in the same way, but you do see certain trends, and gender becomes this like vital vector that people are using against each other to kind of gatekeep, I think, which is really unfortunate.
And this is very important because I think often when we think about Sufi and the public consumption of Sufi, we're often thinking about the non-Muslim group, but there are also internal dynamics in relation to, so intra-Muslim dynamics. And I think your book does an excellent job to kind of amplify both aspects, right? And so the commodification argument is there. Of course, the Islamophobia argument is there, which we're familiar with, but I think the book does also an excellent job in actually thinking through the circulation of these interpretations of Islam within Muslim communities too, which have, as you mentioned, they have an entirely different set of politics there to consider.
Exactly.
I will just, perhaps we'll have a chance to take one more question and then we will thank our speaker. Let me see what's not answered. There's lots of praise for you in the chat. I don't know if you're...
Oh, I'm not.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
There's a student who's asking, could you name some people who were involved in debates about Sama in the classical period?
Yeah, so some of the Sunni theologians, men, literate kind of men that are having these discussions are Al-Ghazali, Hamid Al-Ghazali, and his brother also Ahmed, who had a very different approach to it. So, on the one end, one Ghazali brother is kind of a bit more rigid, I think, and the other is like, let's just let it all open. Suhrawardi is another theologian that's also, so those are some. And then, of course, there's a lot of poets like, Rumi himself, Shabastari. The poetic approaches to Sama are really far more fluid in the sense that Sama is just this opening. Like the idea to get caught up in the actual ritual negates the fact that the point of the ritual is to become non-subjective, like to erase the self. And so the poets do a really great job. Is like, why are we talking about music? Why are we talking about movement? The point is to annihilate the self. All these things are not mute, like get past it and go to the thing. And so if you think of Sama as really like a vehicle to the Sufi goal of annihilation of the ego, then they're kind of like not interested in that, right? I don't want to have this conversation about legal permissibility of music, and did the Prophet Muhammad allow music, or did he listen to it? So there's like a really great range. The Brethren of Purity, you know, that have some interesting connections. Philosophy, Neoplatonists, and the Smiley Connections too are like another great group that have different treatises on this as well, because they were really interested in the arts from a really Neoplatonic sense as well, which is quite fascinating. So there's a really rich tradition. And Avery Kenneth, who I mentioned in the slides, is a good person to start with. He's done a lot of great work on Sama, and I'm borrowing from these kind of brilliant scholars to make the case for this.
Excellent. Thank you for these resources. This was such a pleasure. Thank you for teaching us. And I'm sure we're now moving on to my class, and I'm sure my students will have a lot more to say. Thank you for visiting, and hopefully we'll invite you again and have another conversation soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheila, so much. It's so great to connect and hang out with you. And thank you to all the folks who showed up. I super appreciate it. And thanks to the students as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.